Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to another MassMEDIC virtual program. I am Brian Johnson, I'm the president of MassMEDIC, and it's my pleasure today to welcome you to our program entitled Patient Engagement in Medical Device Clinical Development. This program is brought to you with the support and direction of Medidata Solutions, our great partner and member. Our session today will really focus on medical device companies and how we can better engage and work with patients. It's going to be a discussion format, so there'll be no slides today, just a free-flowing, great discussion with our speakers. Our speakers are Alicia Staley, she's the Vice President of Patient Engagement at Medidata Solutions. Anna Legassie, she's the Senior Manager of Patient Affairs at Explore Therapeutics. And then Stephanie Reffey, she's the Patient Advocacy and Alliance Relations Director at Exact Sciences. I'm thrilled to welcome these three really incredible speakers to the program, and I'm going to be sitting back and learning along with you. Quick housekeeping note, we are recording this program, so it will be available on demand shortly after the webinar is complete. I also will be monitoring the Q&A tab, so if you have a question and want to submit it, you can go ahead and submit it into the Q&A tab at any time during the presentation. And if not, you can also send it into the chat bot where we'll all be able to see it. With that said, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Alicia. I'm going to remind my panelists that you're all on mute, so why don't we come off mute? And Alicia, the floor is yours, so to speak.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. It's an honor to be here today and be joined by Anna and Stephanie. I'm just really excited to get into this conversation because I think it's such an important panel to have at this point in time. Obviously there's a lot going on in the world with COVID-19, a lot of conversations around clinical trials, clinical research, and I think it's really an opportune time for us to really look at what we're doing, how we're doing it, and making sure that we're delivering solutions and options to patients that really make sense, because I think this industry is under a tremendous amount of scrutiny at this time, and we just have this this is a point in time where we can really start to make some change and really push things forward. So with that, in that spirit, I'm really excited to be joined with Anna and Stephanie here today. We're going to get started on a couple quick topics around patient engagement and its importance to this industry, particularly med devices. For us, patient engagement and patient centricity is really critical conversations to have when you're talking about establishing proper frameworks to provide solutions for patients and participants in clinical trials. And for us, developing an empathetic lens in the way that we look at clinical research and device development in particular is so important. And I really want to just jump right in here and perhaps turn it over to Anna and get your thoughts on, why is patient engagement so important, not only to clinical research, but medical devices in particular? I think it's a unique question to ask in this space. And, given your position in the industry and your personal experience, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on all this.
Well, thank you, Alicia. So if you think about it, patient engagement conceptually really started in the clinical setting. And so when we talk about patient engagement in the clinical setting, we're talking about patients that are actively engaged, informed, and partnering in their care. And so I think the best example of this would be conceptually the idea of shared decision making, right? So to me, patient engagement in device development and trials is really an extension of this aim. It's an opportunity for patients to be equally engaged and informed and participate in hopefully shared decision making with the industry. And it's an opportunity to play, a really critical role in the development process to make sure that the interventions that industry are developing are really in line with the expectations of patients, that they're relevant to patient needs, that they're relevant to patients' expectations for quality of life and improvement to the current standard of care. And so this also gives industry the opportunity to really leverage all of this expertise in a meaningful way.
that's a great point. I think what you're talking about is just building these like foundational elements for having these kinds of engagements. You can't, there's absolutely no opportunity for shared decision making if you don't have that sort of that stakeholder, or I shouldn't even say stakeholder, but just a platform for conversation and openness and honesty, you know, in what's needed to have these conversations. And I know, Stephanie, when we were preparing for this, you talked a lot about sort of those foundational elements or those cornerstone elements that you need when it comes to patient centricity and patient engagement. I would just love to see, get your thoughts and see what you can build on what Anna just shared with us.
Yeah, I completely agree with Anna, and I think those are excellent points. In the medical device industry, the patients are end users of our products, and if we aren't meeting their needs, we won't be successful. Patients are the why for what we do. And to be patient focused or patient centric, which are buzzwords we throw around a lot, you really have to engage with patients directly to understand what their needs are and how to meet those needs. We at Exact engage directly with patients quite frequently, as well as patient advocacy groups, to help us understand what those needs are and then fill them, and then engage them throughout the process. So even as early as setting our strategy and determining what our goals are, we like to get patient input in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're both highlighting is this need for open and sustained conversations. You know, you can't begin to assume what a patient needs without actually having these sometimes tough conversations with them. So thank you so much for both of you pointing that out. I think it's critical to build upon this as our conversation continues to evolve today. At this point in time, I'm going to ask Brian to put up our first poll question for everybody that's participating from home today. The question for us on the poll, I'll just wait. What new techniques and technologies have you adapted? Oh, well, that's question 2. Sorry. Can you go back to question 1?
Oh, that's interesting.
Possible. Technical difficulty.
I knew it. I knew we'd have a problem here. All right. Let me pull this back.
I can try to sing and dance, but I don't think you'd want that at this point in the show.
Give me 1 second here. I'm just gotta make sure. Question 1.
And Anna's back. There we go. We had a little TV timeout for Anna.
Just hopefully improve my sound quality for everyone.
There we go. All right. Thank you so much, Brian. All right. So we're going to leave this question up for about 45 seconds. Hopefully it won't take you much longer to answer it than that. But how well does your company incorporate the patient voice in clinical development? So are you utilizing the patient perspective and the patient voice at every step? Most of the time, sometimes, rarely, or never. We'd really love to just see, for those of you that are participating in our call today, where you're at in this process, just to sort of level set as we begin our conversation today. So if you take a moment there, feel free to respond to the poll question, then we'll keep going. We're also monitoring the Q&A tab and the chat tab. So if anybody has any questions or has any difficulties in today's webinar, please utilize the chat or the Q&A just to reach out to us, and we'll make sure to address that immediately. So, all right, 5 seconds. I'll do my Jeopardy theme song now. And then perhaps, Brian, if you can display the results, that would be great.
Yep, I will. I'll do my best. I will tell you that as of right now, somewhat, but not enough. And most of the time are really about 70+% of the respondents.
That's good. All right. So awesome. This is an engaged audience that is doing some of the hard work, which is really, really good. So thank you, everybody, for sharing that. I appreciate that. There we go. All right. Somewhat, but not enough most of the time. Shout out to the 4 folks that responded every step of the way. And for the few folks that responded, never. That's okay. We can always make little improvements day by day. So awesome. All right. So let's move on. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. So I think key to the question that we just had was really interesting to see where people are sort of falling out here in the spectrum. But one thing that's really important to all of this question in this format is the patient journey. So what is the med device patient journey, and how can it impact the trial design, outreach, and potential engagement? And, you know, for me, when we're talking about the patient journey in the med device space, it's really about, you know, what is the patient going through? What are the key touch points and checkpoints that a patient has to go through in their journey? And without that understanding of what the patient is going through, even on a day-to-day basis, it becomes very difficult to design solutions or even work with a med device, or even find out how a med device would actually impact the patient's life or quality of life, day-to-day functioning. And I think it's really incumbent upon us when we're in this space to make sure that we understand the patient journey, not just vis-a-vis the device itself, but everything that sort of encompasses that patient's day-to-day functioning. Stephanie, I'm going to start with you on this question. Would just love to get your thoughts about the patient journey, particular to the med device industry. What does it mean for your organization to dig into this patient journey? And what are you looking for when you go through an introspection like that?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I agree with everything you just said. It's really important to understand what the patient journey looks like and how the patient will use the device in their journey in order to be successful. Steve Jobs is credited with a quote saying that you've got to start with the end user and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and make it fit. And I think that's a great analogy for the med device industry in this particular space. We need to understand how the patient will use whatever device or test it is that we're developing in order to be successful. At Exact, we create tests for cancer, diagnostic and screening tests. And a good example is needing to understand how patients look at risk and weigh their decisions in order to use our tests. So our Oncotype DX genomic prostate cancer test helps men decide if they are able to pursue active surveillance instead of going immediately into treatment. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, if a man's not willing to, if active surveillance isn't something he's willing to consider or makes him very nervous, he's probably not going to use our test. Whereas if he really is looking for another option, that's a perfect fit for him. So we need to take that into consideration. As we're developing tests in the pipeline, we need to understand how patients consider those risks and the value of whatever information we're offering to them as well. So I think that's one great example. Clinical trials are another great example, right? If you involve patients in the clinical trial process, in the design of them, and have them review the materials, they'll tell you if it's interesting, if it's something they're willing to participate in, if what you're asking for is too much. Time and time again, I've had patients ask really relevant questions about the eligibility criteria that make it easier to recruit patients into the trial, and often help you get better results. And they'll tell you if it's not something that they're going to participate in, and then you probably need to go back to the drawing board because you're going to have trouble accruing. So involving patients and understanding their perspective is really critical for what we do, I think.
Yeah, and you really make a good point that it's without that understanding, it's almost like you're throwing a dart at a dartboard trying to figure out what's going to be the right approach. And I think what you're suggesting, it takes effort, and it has to be sort of built into this process. You know, you're going to have these conversations up front, really learn as much as you can about the patient to truly understand and build this sort of empathetic lens of reviewing what they've got to go through. So I'm glad that you pointed that out. And I want to turn to you. I know that you've had some interesting interactions with medical device industry in your career, both personally and professionally. So I guess I'll just throw it over to you to see what you can share on this one.
Well, interesting is definitely a good word for it. I sometimes say unique, and that's because I was diagnosed with systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis when I was 11. And just 3 years later, had total joint destruction of my hips that required bilateral hip replacements at age 14. So just for a frame of reference, I was a freshman in high school at the time.
Wow.
But even at such a young age, I was a really engaged patient in that clinical setting, right? And so my two biggest questions going into surgery were, one, how long can I expect my joints to last? And two, will I eventually be able to safely carry and deliver my own children?
Mhm.
So 25 years later, the surgical technology has really changed a lot, but it was my experience over the last 25 years that I've had 3 revision surgeries on my right hip replacement and 1 on my left. So I've never really had a clear expectation about how long my joints could or should or would last. And today, the literature for women with any sort of joint replacement for women of childbearing age is virtually non-existent, as is often the case when it comes to any sort of research done in any sort of trial setting for any sort of intervention in women of childbearing age.
Yeah.
So I think the most frustrating part about that is, even though we don't have a ton of clear data for patients, say, under the age of 45, we do know that the younger cross set of patients, so patients 45 to 65, we've seen an exponential growth in joint replacements for both knee and hips in the last 20 years. And even though it's unlikely that a lot of younger patients, myself included, even today, would ever be included in these trials, there's still a lot that can be done, I think, by developers to do better by patients and by these younger patients, whether it's post-approval surveillance, right? So we can have a better understanding of how long these joints are actually lasting for patients, or patient registries to catch all of that, the nuance of the data in individual patients. And what that really translates into is, one, truly better expectation setting for patients as far as how long they can expect these joint replacements to last, and the ability to make much more informed decisions about their healthcare long term. And also, and perhaps most importantly, provide a mechanism of communication for things like product recalls, which unfortunately we still see fairly often with these implants. I think the last thing that I would say, regarding the development process is, if you think about joint replacements, they're really they're really an intervention of last resort. If you need a joint replacement, you have likely reached a point in your disease progression where you're no longer able to walk or participate in activities of daily living. And they're a pretty permanent solution. So it's really, when we talk about engagement and we talk about the development process, we really need patients and a more representative group of patients involved from the get-go, as early in the development process as possible. And what we really need is for developers to have a much better understanding of expectations. What are our patients' expectations for quality of life on the other side of a joint replacement? And I think one of the places that this data could be used, or perhaps it's most desperately needed, is informing the post-op rehabilitation and recovery guidelines for younger patients. They're really outdated and pretty archaic right now as far as how we rehab patients after these surgeries.
Yeah, I mean, you raise an amazing point that, and it's almost hard to wrap your mind around it if you haven't been in your position. Is this the device is quote unquote left behind? You're actually having a device put in your body, and while it's imperative to talk about the quality of life for the patient that's receiving that device, there's almost like a quality or a longevity question that needs to be asked or discussed with the patient about the device in and of itself. We saw this in the breast cancer communities. This has come to the forefront in the breast cancer communities for women that had bilateral mastectomies with reconstruction of different kinds of implants, where they're having implant failure, and now they're having revision surgeries and extraction surgeries that are happening 8 to 10 years after they had these things put in. And I think no one ever really, those were not questions that were ever really asked in the breast cancer communities when people are trying to make a decision about a surgery or an implant option. So you raise an amazing point that I think we have to be much more cognizant of is, the devices that are actually being utilized, whether they're a quote unquote leave behind device or not, is what's the longevity for these things? What's the how will these function? What's the degradation of this device? Are you expecting a degradation, and how do we work that into what we're thinking of when it comes to the patient experience? And that sort of lines up very nicely with what we've been doing at Medidata. We've come up with these 5 pillars around the concept of patient experience and patient engagement, where we really feel like when we're having these conversations, if we're not hitting on these 5 key pillars, it's a miss. And the pillars for us are education, trust and transparency, awareness, connection, and collaboration. And we feel like you have to come at it from all these different tenets in order to make sure that conversation is really taking place. And Anna, I'm going to start with you on this one again. Knowing that what we know now and what we've heard from both you and Stephanie around the concept of the med device patient experience, what are some key call outs that you'd like to make around improving this experience? Like, what do we need to do to start making this better? Or what questions do we need to ask to start, surfacing more information for us?
Well, I'm going to continue beating the drum that I beat in every venue when it comes to patient engagement, and it's to engage early and engage often. There's no such thing as too early to engage with patients. If you are whiteboarding an intervention, you are at the point where you should be including patients at that point. And I think something that happens far too often, whether it's health tech, therapeutics, whatever it is by the time patients are engaged, it's often too late to make meaningful changes to either, I would take maybe a little bit off topic for this group, but I would take, biologic development. Too often I've been asked to come in and consult about sort of the mechanism of delivery for biologics, and it's already too late. We're already working with a very fixed in time product or fixed in time point in the development process. So I think, as early and as often as is possible to engage to engage the patient community, but also the patient advocacy groups that can help you have a much further reach, and to really help industry build trust within the patient community, which is a huge part of this. And I think that I think one of the biggest issues that I see is a gap in understanding need, right? So in order for industry to do this well and to do it right, it can't be a check the box activity. And so what I mean by this is I think you have to be willing to, throughout the development process, ask really tough questions about the product in question. And so I think probably the most tangible one would be, does this intervention actually meet the needs expressed by the patient community? And if it doesn't, what is the intent behind developing it? Patients and patient communities are only getting more savvy as the years go on. And very often that, sort of first engagement and it is a first impression, and it's very easy to lose the trust of the patient community if they don't feel as though we are all aligned in developing, better interventions, better products, better devices, and better value and better impact for patients. So, if you're going to take on patient engagement, it has to be intentional and with the goal of having a meaningful impact on the development process, because patients will very easily be able to suss out if it's just a check the box activity. And if it is, you will lose your best ambassadors for your products.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Without that trust, without that sort of buy-in from the beginning, if you alienate the patient communities, you're sort of behind the 8 ball from the get-go. So, Stephanie, I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Why is it that patient engagement is so important in this space, and what can we do to improve the patient experience?
Yeah, I think that I just have more of the same, but I think there's a really big difference between working for patients and working with patients. And we talk a lot in the industry about working for patients. I think we all do what we do to improve lives, make things better for patients. But if they aren't at the table and decisions are being made without their input, it's just not the same thing at all. And if we would involve patients, and when we do involve patients, not only do we engender trust and have input into what we're doing, but they also learn more about our industry and the challenges we face. And it becomes more of a reciprocal relationship where they can help us while we are helping them.
Mhm.
And I think that's really important. I would
No,
also,
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
sorry, including patients and being transparent with them. Also, well, what I just said.
Yeah.
It works for all of us in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to acknowledge that I'm seeing some questions come in the Q&A tab, and I promise that we will get to those right away. We just got 2 more questions that I'd like to go through and just another poll. So keep putting those questions in. I'm actually lining them up because I think I've got the right people to answer them. So one question or one area that I want to touch on today that I know is always a difficult conversation to have. It's around diversity and inclusion, particularly in the med device clinical research. How can we approach this subject in this space? Or, what would you like to add to this conversation today around the concept of diversity and inclusion? I know that as 3 Caucasian women on a panel, I guess we're probably not the experts in diversity and inclusion, but I think as representatives for the body of work that we all do and the communities that we participate in, I think we have some good thoughts on what it means to be better when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Stephanie, I'm just wondering if you've got anything that you'd like to add around this concept.
Yeah, sure. So again, acknowledging that we aren't really diverse on this particular panel, representation is really critical. And if you don't intentionally include different populations, be it gender, ethnicity, age, even socioeconomic status, you can't really assume that you are serving those populations.
Right.
And it gets back to what I was just talking about. If you invite those voices to the table and you work with those populations, you engender trust, and you start understanding their individual journey, and they're just like the broader patient journey, and it works together to serve everybody.
Yeah. And I know that you recently attended a conference where you had an interesting conversation, or you had an interesting aha moment, I guess, around diversity and inclusion. I'm just wondering if you could share that with us today as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was fortunate enough to attend NORD's Breakthrough Summit back in, I guess, October now. And out of 2 days of presentations, one of my biggest takeaways came from Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, who's, of course, the president of BIO, and what she had said about diversity in trials, to the point that I actually went back and stopped the recording so I could get this, because I just think it's such an important point, which is the social contract around clinical trials is broken. How do we ask patients to take on the burden of trial participation on top of their illness to test a product that they might have access to at the end of the day? We have depended on the overwhelming goodwill of patients to conduct trials up until now, and it's time to reconsider how we incentivize people to participate in clinical trials. We, of course, don't want to skew the population, but we need to ensure that we are representing it. And I think her point about access is really important if we want more diverse and equitable and inclusive trials. And I think what a lot of folks mean when they talk about that is having more participation from traditionally underserved communities in trials. And if we want that, then what we have to do is think about how we ensure there's access post-approval. Otherwise, I don't really know how we'll ever truly meaningfully move the needle on this issue. I think it really starts more with access than the trial itself.
Yeah, I think we're at a very interesting point in time too. I think with everything going on with what we're learning about COVID and the outreach that's been needed, not only for the vaccine trials, but just vaccine distribution, we've learned a lot about disparities in healthcare and breakdowns in ways to reach communities that have been historically marginalized. And I think that if we learn anything from this pandemic, it's how important it is to build better relationships with all neighborhoods and all communities, really in the spirit of taking care of each other. We have to do better. So I'm hoping that we can sort of build on some of this momentum that we're seeing coming out of this pandemic. If there is a silver lining to this at all, hopefully it's in how we learn to care for each other in better ways. So that's great comments from both of you on that topic. I know it's a difficult one across clinical research always to talk about issues in diversity and lack of inclusiveness. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Brian, I'm going to call you back and ask you to put up our second question, if you can.
Okay, here we go. Let me, this is fun. All right, I'm relaunching it.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right. Question 2 for the audience. What new techniques or technologies have you adopted during the pandemic to engage with your patients? So anybody out there willing to share how they've had to pivot during the pandemic? So video conferencing, chat bots, streaming videos, mobile app data collection, virtual support groups, anything that not represented here, you can throw it into the other bucket or add them in the chat. Let's see.
Looks like a lot of Zooming.
Love it. I know. I think we're actually taking advantage of one of those technologies today, right? Zoom.
Absolutely. Looks like looks like video conferencing is the primary, with mobile app data collection and streaming videos being sort of the winner here. I'll call awesome. 5 more seconds on this, and then we will go ahead.
All right, let's check it out. Video conferencing, yeah. Oh, a couple folks with chat bots. That's awesome. Streaming video, mobile app collection, a lot of others. So maybe people will add those comments into the chat for us so we can see. But yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks, Brian, for popping that up for us. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think, like as we were talking, the previous topic around diversity and inclusion, perhaps there's some of these tools that we can leverage to make better connections with some of our communities that just haven't been engaged in research like we'd like them to. So great questions, great conversation. We've got one last question I want to tee up for both of you. Given that, the question we just asked was really tech focused, obviously we had to rely on a lot of technologies throughout the pandemic to help us get through all of this. But, we've got an opportunity to look at how technology can really impact patient engagement, particular to the med device industry. I want to be mindful that, technology for technology's sake is not always the best answer. And, I think we've all been guilty a little bit of the shiny object syndrome, where we see something that looks cool. Like I just, perked up when I saw chat bots. So I'm sure you can figure out what I think is a cool technology, but we have to be mindful that with every new technology that we bring into the fold, we have a potential for creating what I call a technical divide or technology divide, which again begins to potentially start to leave patients out again. It's just yet another barrier that could potentially impact how med devices, technical solutions leave people behind. when it comes to clinical research. So Stephanie, I'm hoping I can start with you just to get your thoughts on this. What is it about technology that we can leverage that can help this experience without creating this like a negative swing in the adoption curve, if you will?
Yeah, sure. Like you, I love technology. And I think one of the potential silver linings of the whole pandemic is that people have gotten a lot more comfortable with technology like video conferencing and streaming. That opens up possibilities for video-based and online clinical trial education and consenting for decentralized trials, which if we do it well, would address a lot of the challenges that we've seen with clinical trials. More easy accrual, more easy diversification, if it's done thoughtfully and right, and having those right voices at the table. In addition, I think it helps us give feedback to those patients that participate with us, right? So dashboards, collaboration tools, all help us give feedback to patients on how we use their information and what the next steps are, what we're finding from that information. And finally, I think it allows us to look at data in different ways. We can gather more data more easily. And more data isn't always better, but sometimes you can combine data in ways that you weren't able to before, just because you can now get biometric data in addition to the clinical features and the pathological features, and look at those in different ways to sort of understand what's really going on with the patient and identify in better detail who is responding, maybe why they're responding, to improve our products.
That's a great point. Great point. Anna, love your thoughts on this one as well. What do you think?
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned like looking for some silver linings in the pandemic, right? I think, sort of initially and throughout the pandemic, I was so excited about the prospect of decentralized trials and what could this mean? And it gets the heart of some of these, diversity issues that we've talked about. And something that was really interesting to me and gave me pause sort of throughout this was how many patients declined the opportunity to have home visits and home healthcare. When I really sat back and I thought about it, wow, that makes so much sense. Home is the sanctuary that we go to, right? It's something that we like to keep separate from our patient life and the medical encounters. And so I think it actually ties more to the successful adoption of technology than we realize. And it really highlights the need for this trust and this transparent with industry and developers, because if you think about whether it's virtual visits or wearables or other remote monitoring devices, patients who choose to use those are essentially inviting development teams into their home with them, which is a very vulnerable position for patients to be in. So there has to be trust that we, and I'm using sort of this collective we here, are all working together to develop solutions that actually meet the needs and expectations of patients. And I'm so glad that Stephanie brought up the idea of dashboards and how we communicate data back to patients, because I think that that's another huge component of this, is how we serve as good stewards of this data and report back to patients what we did with it and how was it used to inform the clinical trial process.
Yeah, it's almost hard to think about it sometimes in those, we've gone to this decentralized, or we'll have a nurse show up at your house for blood collection and specimen collection, or we'll check on your med device, and it's hard to think about, perhaps patients don't want that. It's almost like you've got the house cleaner analogy, like the cleaner's coming on Tuesday, so Monday I have to clean my house, kind of thing. And now you're inviting nurses or mobile phlebotomists into your house. And I heard that from patients. They're like, it's now when they come for the blood draw, it's like the cleaners are coming that day. I need to clean up my house. I need to get ready because it's, I'm hosting company, I think is what one of the women told me that was on one of these virtual trials, that it just, I guess I had never even thought of it that way. Like you said, though, the home is a sanctuary. So are we presenting this in a way that makes sense for people that do they want to continue to engage knowing that this is part of the process? And we just have to be mindful of that. And I think that we're all learning so much about ways that this can be better, in probably ways that we never even anticipated. So it's a wonderful conversation today. I thank you both for being here with us. And I want to put one last question to both of you, and we'll sort of just yell it out if you'd like. If you had one key takeaway from our conversation that you want people to remember or think of when they think of this webinar, what would it be?
I'll yell it out. I think it's never too early to engage a patient.
Well, that could almost be on a bumper sticker. So
Yes.
I like that. Yeah. Awesome. What about you, Anna?
Echo that. And I'd say if you don't have the expertise in-house, I know that now device companies are a little bit further behind in biotech and pharma as far as having patient affairs and patient advocacy. Go out and get it. There's so many consultants now that can help you do this, build this work, build a sustainable model for your organization. And to Stephanie's point, it's never too early. It's never too early to go engage the services.
Oh, that's a great question. It's engage early, engage often, seek out the patients because the patients are the experts. The concept of the patient consultant, I think, is really finally coming into its own. Patients that have these lived experiences are true experts on their condition, and industry is really rising up and surfacing some of these patients in ways that I don't think even 10 years ago were possible. So I appreciate that. We're going to turn it over to Q&A now, and I see that we've got a lot of questions in our Q&A segment. So I'm just going to, I guess, start at the top and see if anybody's got anything. Hi, Brian.
Hi, so do you want me to call them out for you, or do you?
Oh, yeah, that would be great, actually.
Okay, sure.
I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Welcome back. I'm going to start from the top here. I wonder if any of the speakers were able to engage patients in the reimbursement of medical devices. In the case of the insurance, hospitals would not be willing to pay a higher price for a better product with clinical evidence. It's a good question, utilizing patients on the reimbursement question.
So thanks for the softball. You go right to the hard question. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, this has always been one of the hardest questions to answer, because it's just really, it's difficult. It's really difficult to figure out the insurance maze and how it fits in, not only when it's clinical research, but just in general healthcare conditions. So it's always a question, the concept of the patient burden and the financial aspects of either a clinical trial or even a treatment journey option that they might be considering. We have to start considering the financial aspects and the reimbursement aspects of what we're asking patients to do, because a lot of times, from the industry perspective, it should be a slam dunk, and then the patient just ends up trying to weed their way through this quagmire of reimbursement and payment that makes it difficult to even participate. But I'm sure Stephanie and Anna have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I do. I think it's a great question. And this is where I find working with patient advocacy groups when they exist is really an excellent, I don't want to say solution, but I don't have a better word, because reimbursement and the cost of medical care is one area where patients and the device companies tend to align, right? We both want coverage.
Yep.
Nobody wants anybody to go bankrupt because they had our test or needed our device or needed treatment. And so together we can really work towards that end. We work at Exact, we work with different cancer patient advocacy groups on a lot of reimbursement issues, as well as some regulatory issues. And I think it's an excellent way to get the numbers behind what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that could be a whole webinar on its own.
It probably could be.
It's a really, really critical piece, right? So Anna, I don't know if you wanted to add anything or if you want me to move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that, I haven't had a lot of experience in this area professionally, but personally, a lot of my patient advocacy the last 5 or 6 years has really been on the legislative front of ensuring access to care and equitable reimbursement. And so it's incumbent for industry to get involved with those patient advocacy groups from the jump, because a lot of times that's where we as patients end up, is lobbying for legislative guardrails that ensure reimbursement. And to carry that burden on top of managing your care and on top of navigating insurance is just mind-boggling. But also to understand that that's sort of the downstream effect is if we don't get ahead of these reimbursement issues during development, a lot of times the only mechanism of actions that patient and advocacy groups find themselves with is lobbying to elected officials.
Yeah. Great
Absolutely.
point.
So Alicia, I mean, I don't know if they're getting easier, but I'll keep going. Our next question is, once the device or test is available, how do companies use or communicate the fact that patients were part of the development of the product? And continue to communicate that as time goes on, and don't let that fact go away. So I guess, effective ways to communicate the fact that patients were intimately involved in the development.
Well, I can tell you from the metadata perspective how we do it around when we're building our software. We actually have a patient insights board made up of 12 patient advocates that work with me on a weekly basis, actually, that come in and are reviewing our software designs. They are really integrated into our software development lifecycle at this point, where they're reviewing wireframes. They're seeing mock-ups as the product is being developed. And then when they go through this whole process, at the end of the whole development process, we go through a certification process. And we actually just finished our first certification for one of our products, which meant our patient advocates were with us for the entire life cycle of that solution being developed, which I think is pretty awesome. And I'm hoping other folks in the industry adopt that kind of mindset, where if you've had patient advisors or patient advocates participating throughout the entire development life cycle, champion that. When you're rolling out your product, make sure that you're communicating that back to the patient advocacy groups. If you're developing a device that's specific to a therapeutic area, make sure you're sharing that with the patient advocacy groups and communicating that with the rest of the folks in industry, because I think it's a very important thing to talk about, that the more and more patients we can get involved in the solutions that we're trying to develop across the industry, the better it's going to be for everybody. And the patients become ambassadors for, in some ways, the products and solutions that we're rolling out, and really want to take ownership in the solutions that we're developing, because they've been such an integral part of it. And I'm really proud of that work, and I'm hoping that some of the rest of the industry sets up similar programs, because I think it's a win across the board, no doubt.
I think another good way is if patients have been involved in the design and the execution of your trials and your validation studies, cite them, include them as authors on the paper, at least acknowledge the support from the group or from the individual patients that contributed. They contributed just like the scientists did.
Anybody else, yeah.
And also, just beyond traditional publications, there's a lot of opportunities to produce white papers, different case studies, and really ensure that the language is patient and layperson friendly. I've gotten the opportunity to participate in efforts like what Medidata is doing, and then getting to see them through all the way through to the production of the white papers. And it's by far the coolest thing that I get to do as a patient advocate, is have a tangible work product that says, this is what I did, this is how I made an impact, and to be able to disseminate that to other patients within the community to show them that these opportunities exist is huge.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Okay, next question. At what point is IRB oversight required Can potential users of an innovative device be asked about product design, use, research design without IRB review and approval?
So we're all jumping at that one.
Do we have to send out for an answer on
Yeah.
that one? We might have to.
Phone a friend.
Good question.
Phone a friend.
In my experience, you can engage patients in focus groups and things like that when it's for internal development purposes.
Yeah.
If you plan to put that information out, then you need to get it IRB approved. But if it's for internal purposes, you can do it internally.
Okay, let's mark that one done. Do HCPs care that patients have been involved in the development process, or how do we show them the value of this and communicate that to a patient, which can provide comfort to the user of the device or test? So if I need to reread that, let me know.
I think it's very similar to the question before in some ways. You know, if patients have been involved in the process of creating or developing a device, I'm assuming that they're asking here, can the HCPs communicate that patients have helped develop this solution, perhaps in a way that would provide comfort to another patient that might be stepping forward to either participate in a trial or use the device for the first time. I think it's absolutely critical that if patients have been involved in this process at any point in the journey, that providers should be talking about, you know, patient partnered development or patient partnered solutioning, because that's really, it's critical. If I know I've been in a med device trial myself, and I had an opportunity to speak with another patient who had been through the trial before me. And I think the opportunity to speak with that patient was, you know, that helped me make my decision to participate, you know, knowing another person's experience, what it was like, what kind of questions to ask. That made me feel much more comfortable. I don't know if you've ever had the same kind of experience or.
You know, it's really interesting if we thread this through the needle of patient engagement, right? All of the research that we have about patient engagement in the clinical setting shows that the more engaged a patient, typically the better the outcomes are, right? So we would all like to think that our healthcare providers would want us to be engaged, whether it's within the clinical setting or the development process, because either way, that level of engagement and shared decision-making is going to lead to better outcomes. I don't know that this is always the case. I think it challenges the status quo, and forgive me or not forgive me for saying, but the paternalism that's inherent in medicine today. And so I think, to the point, you know, when we talk about how do we communicate out to patients that this that patients have participated in development, I think of them as like two swim lanes next to either, you know, that are running concurrently alongside of one another. If we're thinking that we want to communicate to patients that a device or an intervention has included, you know, heavy advisement from patients, we should be thinking about disseminating that same information to providers too. Yeah, this is a really big one to wrap your arms around, as far as how do we make it, because it's tricky, right? How do we we can't ask providers to be ambassadors for devices the same way that we can ask patients to. But I think there is a way to educate them on the development process so that they'll hopefully share it with their patients.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So let's move on to the next one. You may have already sort of said this when you said it's never too early to engage patients, but would you think that early feasibility studies are the right time to engage patients? Or is that too late, maybe? Given that it's never too early.
I'd say it's a good time to engage patients. Again, it is never too early, but early concepts, perfect time.
And I just want to say that I appreciate that building consensus or getting buy-in across the entire organization to do patient engagement, to do it right, is really tricky. So and that's the understatement of the century, probably. So I think early feasibility study is the first place, initially that you can get organizational buy-in to include patients, then yes, that's a great first step with the hope that, next time around, you can get them engaged even earlier.
Great. Here's a good question. Would love input from the panel on experiences or thoughts on if you have a product that has been in the market for a while, how often do you re-engage patients for input to keep things fresh? Or how do you encourage development and marketing teams on the importance of this as things evolve to make sure that patients continue to have input throughout the product's life cycle?
That's a great question. Stephanie, I think I just cut you off, but no.
Go ahead.
I think in some ways that question is almost wrapped up in the definition of innovation. It's, how are you being innovative with solutions that might have been on the market for a while now, or a device that, is 5 or 10 years old, how do you consistently iterate on that? And I think you've got to build that into your process. You can't let something go stale. I think we're starting to see this come up in clinical trials around the concepts of, electronic consent or, informed consent that's captured electronically. People think, oh, it's a one and done kind of thing. Oh, we can capture their signature, but what else? How do we innovate on that? Well, you innovate on that by, you continue to evolve something as simple as an electronic signature capture by constantly talking to your patient communities about how it can be better. It's, how do you evolve informed consent to, more educated consent? What are we looking at that can continually sort of challenge the status quo? Because I think if we get to the point where we're not doing that, that's when we're at risk for really having solutions almost sunset themselves without a lot of effort. So we have to be constantly asking questions about what we can do to improve. What can we be asking to look at this, look at it from all different angles and make sure that you're not just resting on one solution that's done very, very well, but might need some tweaks along the way. So engage early and often and throughout the entire life cycle of the product, even after it's in production. I think we can't rest on our laurels, I guess is the phrase that keeps coming to mind here. So.
Yeah, I would just add, I reiterate something you just said, which is you need to engage patients throughout the life cycle of the product. That includes post-market.
Yeah.
And it probably depends what your device is and what it looks like post-market. But we at Exact have, reports that go to the doctors about the tests and materials that are used to tell the patient about the test so that they understand what's going on. If you don't engage patients in those things, you have no idea if they're understanding the communication. And sometimes patients have really good insights on how to communicate with the healthcare providers too. So there's lots of opportunities to engage post-market as well as pre-market.
Yeah, I know we're out of time, so I'll just add I had the opportunity to participate in a lot of patient advisory boards on existing products. And it's been such a great experience to, solution around education that new patients initiating treatment might need, the reimbursement issues that we talked about, the access issues. So there's a lot of opportunity post-market to still deliver value to patients on existing treatments.
And I love that Bob put in the chat, technology is always moving forward, so standing still is not an option. I think that's a great way to wrap it all up. Change is the only constant.
Absolutely. So we are at time. There are still a couple questions. Maybe if you have 2 minutes, we could rapid fire them, and it'll be sort of available on the recording. Okay. What advice do you have regarding engaging nurses? And we can make this quick.
Do it. Absolutely. Yeah. Like sign them up. If you've got nurses that are going to use a product or are going to be a key participant in either educating a patient about how a product works or device works. Make sure they're involved in any reviews that you're doing or any educational content development, because they're your frontline folks. So make sure you're engaging with them so they understand the process and you're not just dropping something on them, expecting it to sort of flow seamlessly into their day-to-day work.
Yeah, absolutely. If we want to have feedback on a new version of a medical device, should we ask patients who use the current version in clinical in the clinical studies to test it, or should we engage with new patients?
Both. I would,
Both.
you want to ask existing patients where the shortcomings are. What is the gap in between your idealized quality of life and the current, devices that exist, and then engaging new patients for a fresh perspective on their expectations for treatment outcomes. And you want both. You want all of the data, all of the time.
All right. Here's the last one. How do we go about identifying new technologies which enhance patient engagement, including those that are not yet with medical devices? I thought this was kind of a neat question. We looked at obviously Zoom has kind of crossed the chasm, or video conferencing into a mainstream, some would say, way of life. Do you look at the consumer side? I mean, I know things have to move a little slower, but I don't know if any of you guys have kind of keep your eye out for new tech that you can use to engage with patients with.
I would say you have to start with the need, just like you have to start with the need for the devices that we're developing. But if there's a need, odds are these days somebody's developing a technology.
That's true.
Engaging early, I would just say that when it comes to technology, engaging early can help you get out in front of any sort of accessibility issues, depending on the patient population. Not all of these technology solutions are accessible to all populations for a variety of reasons. So understanding the need and the accessibility is huge.
Absolutely.
And I would say just pay attention to the patient communities. Be actively listening to these communities online, either Facebook, Twitter, social media, because usually patients are the ones stumbling across some of the either newer technologies or finding something in some other industry trying to bring it into healthcare. So you've got a lot of patient innovators out there that there's always a wealth of ideas and conversations around how can their lives be better, how can a process be more efficient. So I think you'd be surprised at what you learn by just staying engaged with patient communities.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to call it there. Wow, what a robust Q&A session. That was wonderful. And what a great conversation. And that's a sign that you put together a heck of a webinar, Alicia. I want to thank you, Alicia, for moderating a great panel. Anna, thank you so much for your insights. Stephanie, for your insights. I know it's always your time is very valuable, so we very much appreciate it. And thank you to Medidata Solutions for your support of this incredible topic. On behalf of MassMEDIC, I'm Brian Johnson, and it was my pleasure to host you for this yet another MassMEDIC virtual event. So we'll be back soon, and have a great day. Thank you.